Hey everybody, Paul Mack here. I've got another viewer question. This viewer is asking a question about pole barn construction, particularly using poles that are tapered because, most trees have a gradual taper in them. They're not all like telephone poles perfectly straight. So how do you deal with that taper in building a pole barn? This is kind of what he's asking about. He says, "Hi Paul, since natural poles have lots of bumps, humps, and tend to narrow at the top, how do you make exterior walls plumb? It just seems that wall girts and therefore siding would naturally have a slight inward lean on every wall. Is that okay? Thanks and love what you do, Rich." Well, let me just take a second here to make sure everybody understands what Rich is talking about here. And to do that, I have a little visual model here to kind of make the explanation easier. Now, this little model is basically what you would set up on a larger scale. Nothing is to scale here, but these are batter boards, and batter boards are what you would arrange when you're beginning a building. They help you lay out how square that building is and getting your corners exactly rectangular or square or whatever you're dealing with. Batter boards are something that even modern construction uses to get all of those sides just right, perfectly parallel sides, and therefore perfectly 90-degree corners. So that being said, I've got a little model here that's going to help us in the explanation to Rich about how to deal with poles that are tapered when you're building a pole barn. Now let's just say we've got a perfectly sawn 6x6, 8x8 diameter poles. A lot of people use these. You can buy these at the hardware store. They're treated usually, and they use them for pole barn structures. Well, it's very easy to get these perfectly plumb with your batter string, because you just move them around until they barely touch the string right in the corner, or on the sides if it's a pole in the middle. So it's really easy. You take a level or a plumb bob and you make sure that this outside edge right here is perfectly plumb and barely touching the string, and you're done. Because if it's plumb and it's touching the string here, then it's going to be plumb at the top because this side is a straight edge. Now the problem with poles is that they can be, as Rich pointed out, very irregular. They've got knots in them, they've got maybe slight turns and twists, plus if that weren't bad enough, they have a slight taper all the way up. For instance, a pole like this, or they have knots in them and they're kind of crooked, and well, if you have a pole this bad, you probably need to go find you another pole. But let's say you've got a pole that is at least better than the one I just showed you, but it's got a taper to it. And I'm sorry, this is kind of out of scale. I just found a piece of firewood that I thought would do because it's bigger at the bottom here than it is at the top. So it's obviously got a taper to it. The problem is if you've set this pole to where basically the core here of the pole is perfectly plumb, well, that means your outside edge here is going to be closer in at the top than it is at the bottom. So if you make it touch the string, and then you put girts, as Rich pointed out, or railings on the side here that your wall boards are going to be nailed to, if this railing is here and this railing is here and they're both nailed to this pole, then there's going to be a slight taper from the top to the bottom, outward a little bit. So how do you deal with that? That's what Rich is asking here. Well, for one thing, when I deal with poles that have a taper to them, I make sure I find the straightest edge you can find, if that exists on a pole, and then you'll set this pole to where that one edge, this outside edge, is plumb, which might mean that the core of the pole is leaning slightly toward the outside to make this outside edge plumb. But that's the part that matters, the outside edge. It really doesn't matter what the rest of the pole is doing. This is kind of a guessing game because you may have to kind of guess. You can take a long level that's got a sideways bubble in it and put that against there and just check and basically make as good a guess as you can get as to what that general side, what plumb is for that general side, because again, there's going to be irregularities. You're just basically giving it the best shot. As I said, a long level helps, or a plumb bob that's hanging right here can kind of show you, especially if you got a helper that can hold that plumb bob and you go off and kind of look at a distance and see if it's generally basically plumb and then barely touching the string for that wall. Now, a corner presents another problem because you've got two planes to worry about. So you're going to want to set this pole, even though the core might be pointing outward just a little bit, you're going to want to set this pole so that this plane on this edge is basically plumb in this plane, and then this edge is basically touching the string and plumb on this edge. That way you make sure that these two planes where they intersect are basically plumb on these two edges of the pole. But again, it means that the pole is kind of maybe slightly pointed toward this corner. But that will take care of your problems. And then when you put railings down low, a railing at the bottom and a railing at the top to nail your wall boards to, then your walls are going to be as plumb as you can get them. Now, there would be another option. That would be to set your pole so that the core is perfectly plumb. When you go to add your railings, I mean, this side is going to be a little bit past the string. When you go to set your railings, you're going to have to notch into the pole. You know, if your railing is 2x6 or whatever, you're going to have to notch out a 6-inch wide notch in the bottom for that railing to go, because it's going to sink into the pole a little bit, and then your top railing may just be nailed to the outside, and therefore your railings would be perfectly plumb even though your pole is not. So that would be another option. It's a little more tricky to do it that way, but it can be done, especially if later you find out, well, you've already set the pole and your railings, this outer edge, this down here is maybe not perfectly plumb with this edge up here, and you thought it would be. Well, you can still notch in. If this one is a little further out, you can notch into this one a little bit to set your railings so that your railings are then perfectly plumb on either side. You just don't want to cut a notch so far into the pole that you weaken the integrity of the pole. So you don't want to overdo these notches, but they can get you out of a jam if you find out your railings are not going to be perfectly plumb. By the way, I've written a book, Building an Old-Fashioned Pole Barn. It's written for people perhaps like you who aren't necessarily carpenters but just need a pole barn and you need to build it yourself. It's simple step-by-step instructions covering things like we've talked about today, setting the poles and so forth, and everything from the beginning all the way to finishing a pole barn. Building a pole barn can be intimidating, so I've tried to take all the scariness out of it for you to make it as simple and as safe as can be. So check out the link for Building an Old-Fashioned Pole Barn. I'll have that in the description below. If you have a question about building a pole barn, about really anything on the farm related, leave it in the comment section below. If it's a good question and it'll benefit other people, we'll cover it in another edition of this, the Farmhand's Companion Question and Answer Show. Until next time, I'm Paul Mack, and I'll talk at you later. Bowmate 1, what is the best method of splitting rails? Can you demonstrate? Oh, well, yeah, I've done that on several videos. Watch the video on the, or maybe you'll probably come across it on the playlist. Oh, look, just watch all the videos. You'll come across it eventually.